Thank you very much, Torsten, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. Yeah, perhaps let me start just at the point of the background you gave, especially with respect to the Medical Association. Now and then I look back and I am fascinated and a bit shocked, surprised when I look back. I was actually in my early mid-30s when I was leading the foundation of the Medical Association. I was a youngster as I look back now, and the environment in which we put the medical profession together was both volatile and hopeful in our country. We cut our teeth in terms of our change agency within the profession at that time. There are things we did which, when we look back now, we probably could perhaps approach a little bit differently in our mature age now. The background to the topic draws from my spiritual journey and my professional journey and my political journey in the country. Not in so much as it affects me, but in so much as my lenses mature as I look at how we carry on around as a nation. In particular, it's prompted by the question of rights and strikes, workers' strikes, and with specific reference to the health professions, which is something that I think both the nation and the professions are reluctant to engage publicly on. But I have a suspicion that it's going to be egg on our face as a nation if we don't intentionally engage in it. Because the medical profession and the health professions are iconic among the professions because they look after the life of humanity, biological life of humanity. And so that is something that is very close to the nerve of the nation. But we are avoiding to have a public conversation on this. I raised the question whether the rights culture dances on the floor on a tango with ethics, competitive tango, in the sense that the more the insistence on rights is, the more we get blurred about ethics. And the premise and the lens here is the health professions, and I hope some of you have been watching the trajectory of the behavior and the manner and the character of the profession, the medical profession in particular, and the health professions in general. The pandemic, which we hope we are getting on top of right now as a nation, set a stage where, as a profession, we also directly and indirectly found ourselves tested in terms of the veracity of our integrity and our social sensitive conscience in terms of service delivery on the one hand and self-protection, call it individual rights on the other hand. And now, as of yesterday, or was it the day before, NEHAO, the Union of Education and Health Workers platforms, had in fact, it's been in the talk for a while, a strike which now is given muscle by the fact that there's been PPE tenders, which are astronomical in the magnitude and very shocking in their manner. May I ask you to consider, just looking at this screen, whether it speaks to an ethics conundrum with specific reference again to the health professions and in particular the medical profession, because I do believe that it's in the leadership of the health professions. Do you think there's a question that arises of rights and responsibilities? And I hope, Torsten, people will make notes, and I think let's have the discussion perhaps at the end. Any clash or threatened clash between responsibilities and ethics as this was unfolding and continues to unfold. I raise a question which I think all of us need to have in our mind. When we talk about rights, what rights do rights have? Where do they derive their demand? When we talk about rights, By what right are they? Obviously, I'm going to be speaking now through the lenses of my own worldview, which are firmly biblical, and definitely also experiential, because I've been in the profession now for a long time. I'm a pediatrician for 30 years now. I'm a qualified doctor for 40 years. So I've got enough to draw from, and have been in the leadership of the profession, and also in academic institutions. And some of you may or may not know that I was principal of Medunsa, the Medical University of South Africa in Pretoria, for a short stint during its own transition. So I draw from a reasonably measurable experience in terms of the profession. Now, please accept my working hypothesis here. Before they are rights, I want to aver that they are divine endowments. I would not like to call them rights, but it's endowments, the pleasurable privileges that humanity has got from God. The first one is the essence of identity. I don't have to go into detail. I know that you've got thoughts in your mind as I share that, but there's a divine trait that we're given as human beings, which should dictate how we behave and how we incline ourselves towards life. The second one is that divine identity comes with some level of authority which God gives us. But I think the inclination of those of us who feel threatened by sin is to think of God as a God of controlling authority, punitive authority. But my understanding of authority from the author of authority himself is that authority is for guardianship. It is not for control. So humans have been given that, whether they understand it generally or not. The third endowment we have from God is one of productivity, innovation, innovativeness, productivity. And again, that productivity, my understanding of the word, is not for selfish indulgence, but it's for stewardship on what the Lord has put in our hands to be productive around and to have authority over. And the third one is the ability to discern and have discretion and make choices. And God gives space there without control at all, perhaps with some threatening consequences, but certainly not with control. So God gives us the ability to make judgments and be accountable for our judgments. With all these endowments, allow me to call this one an endowment again, the endowment of ability to be fallible. And where that traps us then is that it gives us what we as humans could enjoy as a right to disobey, but allow me to call it a power to disobey. So we have authority even with God to disobey, as I said, perhaps with some imposition of consequences. The second level of rights, by what right in my imagination, to try and keep it simple, is what I call the collective unconscious. There's a psychologist, psychiatrist who's known for that term. At individual level, there's an unconscious, that subconscious that drives us. But he calls it collective unconscious when we are as a community or a society have something that drives us, which is unconfessed and we're not even conscious of. It's not negotiated, but it's there and it's powerful and it's driving us. Mob psychology, relevant to strikes, for instance, is what, and any form of rebellion by groups, plays in that area. There's a contract and covenant of behavior when there's a strike or some form of rebellion between those who are together in such action or activity. It's subconscious, is very, very powerful. People can be self-sacrificial, bowing to it, even unconsciously. It derives from evolution of culture. I love the way somebody expresses it when they say the foundations are lying on long vanished primary patterns by our ancestors. We've never questioned them, but we embrace them, whether voluntarily or by conscription by our societies. But we go with the flow, as it were, subconsciously. The second level is social responsibilities, perhaps at certain levels negotiated, but ultimately they become covenantal. Certain things just don't get done. Certain things are just naturally expected. But a lot of times these are deriving from collective survival patterns, where as a community we think what works for us as a community are certain behaviors. And so therefore those are taken as social responsibilities. And I want to also say that some of them derive from what I called divine endowments. These go then with social boundaries, limitations of individual freedoms. That means you can enjoy them to a certain extent, and at a certain extent you got to have the ability to blush when you cross the line, and even the preparedness to suffer the consequence should they face you once you cross the line. Then the third one is a practicalization of both the two above, which is the constitution of law, the derivation of law and constitution. Some of you may be aware, but I think most people might not be aware, that the birth of the Magna Carta hasn't got a clean history. It was a dirty history, or a history of pain. It was born in conflict, but then it became a matrix around which a lot of what are now global freedoms have been built around. Isaiah 45 in the Bible speaks of Cyrus, and this is where this derives from. Cyrus gave freedom of religion and space to slaves, and he was an atheist, as the Bible says. And God assertively says, I've appointed him as my prophet, as my ambassador to protect my people. So he didn't qualify by being of the same religion as the slaves for him to be appointed by God on the one hand. And on the other hand, he didn't sympathize with them because he shared their religion. But something very divine gave him the conviction to do so. Then I also just I cannot fail to talk about law and constitution without mentioning Karl Marx and people that he worked with. In particular, and this comes now to the issue of unions and strikes and workers' strikes, he defined a social construct of what he called base and superstructure. And he highlighted that the law can have some biases. This is the best capture I've got of somebody who describes the base and superstructure linkage with reality in terms of how humanity enjoys life or otherwise. I'll give a moment just so that people can just read through that slide. In the context of this conversation, the defendants of the power of the elite becomes relevant because when there are rebellions and strikes, especially by the workforce, that usually is the issue at play at the very least. I think I did illustrate when I started out that the profession, the medical profession in particular, I think the professions generally are facing a steadily growing crisis of conscience in various ways. I think we have seen how lawyers can be accomplices to rot, to social rot. We have seen how accountants, accounting firms have become accomplices to social rot. I have my suspicion that there may be judges, of course, certainly we know during the apartheid era, and I think nothing will have changed in terms of the essence of humanity. There may be judges who are accomplices to sophisticated rot that happens at the bar. So humanity just generally, but the medical profession specifically is the point of focus now, may be facing a looming crisis of conscience. And the profession may not even be aware, I dare say, because there would be more discussion on this if the profession itself was aware. So I'm enjoying my space here just as a civilian to raise issues about the profession, which the profession is not talking to itself about at the moment. Very critically, there's a keeping of the balance that's very, very important. If doctors, let me now be very specific, were to engage in strikes, where they have to consider the question of balancing fighting for their own rights and protecting what I call social ethics. And I think we've had a good exposure of where I'm coming from with that. I would like you to please just, in your own mind, before we get to the questions time, which is not very far now, keep in mind what could be the possible consequences if health workers strike. Forgive the typo there. If doctors in particular strike. Some surveys have been done, and it has been found that, and this, I haven't seen a South African study, it has been found that by some divine miracle, patients are overall in the main, of course, 1 or 2 patients could be directly as death or compromise, could be linked to this, such strikes, but overall, patients generally get spared during the strikes of healthcare workers. And that's just because of the compensatory mechanism where workers who don't get into strike, who don't involve themselves, then pull their sleeves and work a little bit harder than they otherwise would, which of course in the long term could not be sustainable, but they do. The critical point I want to raise here is that if patients don't die during strikes, repeated strikes in particular, could there be something else that dies? I've got my theory about what things may die. What things may die are the endowments that God has given us. The endowment of identity. Identity is not what is on the mirror. I'm talking about intrinsic identity, our inner essence. There's an extent to which the chaos or the acrimony of strikes and rebellion in the long term harbors a slow generation of what I would call a loss of humaneness. We lose social sensitivity. So I believe that dies when strikes go on and on. Rebellious strikes, which tend to, number 2, cause people or those who participate to lose their sense of responsible authority, of guardianship, which is why we see vandalism. The people who vandalize everything around them when they are on strike are not humanly different from ourselves, but they get caught in the spirit of mob psychology, collective unconscious, and that collective unconscious changes with time as these things get protracted or repetitively, infinitely repetitive. Thirdly, even if patients don't die, there's a level of productivity which is compromised. In fact, there's a culture of productivity that gets corroded. And so therefore, if nothing else dies, then vision dies, a sense of long-term vision of what we are here about as workers, as professionals. So certainly, very significant things die during rebellious strikes. The fourth one among the divine endowments which suffer slow death with these activities is the loss of judgment and discretion and ability to make good choices. Desperation can cause distortion of judgment. And the last one then is that we tend to, as humans, console each other in our fallibility. So there's an extent to which we pardon each other for chaos. We just go for scapegoats to try to make the point, but in essence, and this is my view, we pardon chaos. And one of my greatest concerns in the social evolution of South Africa is the pardoning of chaos. That's another presentation on its own when we have time. But I I am worried that South Africa is getting accommodative to chaos. We see it everywhere.
Okay, everyone, the floor is open. So unmute yourself or raise your hand or say something in the chat as well.
Thank you for an interesting presentation and also thought-provoking. And I think my question is around entitlement, especially with the slide that's up. And I think one of the things that I've always struggled with the rights conversation is that it seldom moves over to the responsibility that comes with the rights. And so for me, I think when you take away that responsibility, you create a sense of entitlement. And so this is where I think where we see even doctors and nurses thinking that it's okay to strike, knowing that the work they do is very critical or very time sensitive as well. And so for me, I think my question to you would be, is that the right way to think about it? Or is there another way to think about the rights and entitlement and responsibility conversation?
My position on that is that anybody who has got no clear sense of responsibility should never have rights. That's my personal conviction. Nobody who hasn't got a clear sense of responsibility should have rights. It shouldn't start with rights, it should start with responsibility. So responsibility should not be an afterthought. That's my simple answer to you. And my view is that God's endowment to us was responsibility first, before anything we can call rights. So I agree with you fully. That message needs to go out into the Constitution. Nobody has rights until they've got a good sense of responsibility.
Can I not be facilitator and be question asker for a moment? So just to latch onto what you said there, if I'm not sure if I'm convinced about that you need to have a sense of responsibility before you have rights. So if I think of, for example, I don't know, a small baby surely has certain rights, even though it has very little sense of responsibility at that stage. All it has is needs.
You make a very good example.
Rights, because we are aware of its needs.
You make a very good example there, Torsten, and that example takes us to God. See, the question about rights is not about whether they are claimed or not. It is about whether they are delivered by somebody who's got the endowment of authority, guardianship, stewardship, judgment, and everything that I've mentioned. And so therefore the baby does not claim rights, but the baby is endowed with rights because there are responsible parents around. I think all of us would run away if the baby spoke and demanded what you want to imply are rights and I call endowments. We would all run away from that baby. So God's endowments set the stage for instilling responsibility so that by the time we claim our rights, we've already been endowed with a sense of responsibility. I want to argue that point. I could argue at another place. I think that's how God worked it out. God didn't start with rights, started with endowment for responsibility. And in that context, then the rights emerged.
So basically, if I've understood, the way you use the word rights is you often link it to rights being claimed. Whereas if a right is given, you tend not to use the word rights, you tend to use the word endowments. Am I following you?
That's reasonable. That's reasonable. That's a reasonable interpretation of what I mean. Yes.
Okay. We have a question on the chat. How can we measure the sense of responsibility? I do agree, though, that the sense of responsibility is key and important to all of us. But how would we measure that? How would we know it's there and to what extent it's there?
If I may, I'm going to make the request that we look at trying to look at the big problem, the big challenge being what I'm seeing as a mutation of sense of social responsibility potentially in a profession that is critical. I don't want us to get lost in definitions which may detract from the main issue, unless people promise me that at the end, we'll get back to talking about whether doctors, health workers should strike, withdraw their labor. I wouldn't like that to be lost. I've come here to beg for your advice, what I can take back to my profession. But then to get back to your question, again, then Torsten, I think now we should go back to your favorite slide. I'll ask a question, not in rhetoric, but to try and apply your question. When we say how would responsibility be measured, I would also be saying who by, because the measurement of responsibility may be at 3 levels. One, the index person who's in that situation, the observer, or society. So who measured responsibility? I'd like to start from the inside. If I am the doctor that has got to make a critical conscience about the withdrawal of my labor, then I've got to ask myself the question. Now, this is now answering your question about sense of responsibility and measure thereof. Firstly, who am I? What am I about? What am I then withdrawing my labor about? And then a balance of that responsibility. So the pleasure, initial pleasure of measurement of responsibility should be on the individual. But secondarily then, it's on the judgment of the observers, of the observer or the beneficiary, the society around that person. I hope that helps. I cannot give a matrix, but I can give a method.
Doc, I wonder if you have come across scenarios in maybe other countries with respect to the medical profession and how they go about, registering their discontent. Are there any things that you've been able to countermeasure in terms of how other systems operate, which could perhaps prove useful? I know South Africa is we have a particular socioeconomic dynamic that's quite different, etc. But have you found any useful things from other medical systems and how they operate in other countries with respect to this question?
Yes, we have. There are 3 critical factors that differentiate between ourselves and what we have seen in other countries, which is why I said the published studies that demonstrate that patients don't, on the whole, suffer, have been done in places other than ourselves. There are 3 issues. One is the issue of rule of law and democracy. Whereas South Africa is rated among the top in terms of the practice of democracy, it suffers the fact that we've got social tension that seems to be very unique globally. And that causes a difficulty in terms of what then becomes the best approach for other nations in terms of dealing with conflict, as we speak of, which is engagement. South Africa has got the platform for engagement, but that platform is shaky because we've got a volatile social tension that becomes explosive. There's a social collective unconscious of aggrievement and anger, frustration, and a feeling of betrayal that then undermines even that engagement platform. Sometimes it is fed by, if you saw my first slide, promises that government makes, which in fact are impractical. And so therefore down the line, government is caught with pants down because it can't deliver on its promises. Government makes promises because it wants to make, or the ruling party wants to win votes, but at the end of the day, they can't deliver. So our engagement platform, even though theoretically, in terms of democracy and the rule of law and Bill of Rights and everything that goes with it is firm structurally. It sits on a volatile ground of social tension. The second point of difference then, or the third one, the first one being the environment, the second one being the quality of engagement or the volatility of engagement because of the social environment. The third one is what strikes actually do. And I would like to have a study in South Africa, what happens to our patients when there are strikes by health workers. My hunch is that we probably suffer more pain in terms of loss of life, even beyond the loss of the endowments which I mentioned. So yes, South Africa is in a tenuous situation because of social tension. What I would call collective post-traumatic disorder.
Thank you.
Let me work backwards first to Vera's comment on the chat and then Deline's. So would it be possible just to give us, help us to catch up those of us who are not in the details? What are the specific points of discontent that the doctors want to change? I mean, this isn't about salaries, or isn't just about salaries, is it?
Thank you very much. Let's talk about health workers generally first, and then I'll zoom in on doctors. The areas of discontent, I think, again, if I go back to my first slide, it's well captured there on that first slide. I won't go to it though. What is captured in that slide is the essence of the discontent. Element number one is discontent in terms of incomes. Element number two is a sense of betrayal, which is a failed promise by government, because there was a contractual covenant which promised the escalation of salaries in time, on the scale of time, over 3 years. We're just over 1 year into that 3 years, and government is backtracking on it. Tito Mboweni is unpopular now because he is saying that the burden of salaries in the public sector is unsustainable. Now that's retrospective after a promise was made. The third one doesn't show on that slide, but it's what you mentioned. Conditions of service are also deplorable. The work environment, the tools of trade, the enabling facilitation for best practice suffers a lot. The third one is poverty of leadership, pitiful lack of leadership in terms of Department of Health administration across the country. And the Eastern Cape is a classical example thereof, and it's been in the news all the time. So those are the categories of discontent. But then can I also raise another discontent which is not spoken about publicly? And when I said then, when we founded the Medical Association, there were certain ambitions that we could have tried to temper down. And the founding chairman of the association is on record as having warned, that's about 25 years ago, the founding chairman warned when we were working on something we called occupation-specific dispensation on salaries, which means therefore recognition of experience and category of a health worker. When we did that, the chairman warned the association that we should be careful about the benchmark that we use. Even if we're using public sector benchmarks from countries outside of South Africa, we would then be saying to ourselves, is our country wealthy enough to be able to remunerate at the rate of countries other than itself? If we looked inside and we're benchmarking ourselves against private practice, were we being reasonable? So the question about whether this would be sustainable or not was raised 25 years ago. But the impulse of aspiration at that time choked that voice. In fact, I remember one very senior doctor at a national conference of the Medical Association who stood up and in desperation said, Zolile, we are not all saints like you here. I'll never forget that statement, because it was pleading against something which was very sensible that I was raising, that the coffers and the pockets of government are not going to be sustainable at the rate at which we're laying claim for the worth of our remuneration. I hope I've answered that question fairly, Torsten.
Very well, thank you. And then Deline's question from the chat, is there not a different way of engaging to change other than strikes? Strikes in South Africa seem to end in vandalism, thereby worsening the work environment and in turn leading to another strike, etc. So it becomes this vicious cycle that the strike actually makes it worse, and then that gives us another reason to be discontent and strike. So is there not a different way of engaging? What are some other positive alternatives that could be pursued?
Deline, very humbly and very sincerely, I came here to ask you guys those questions. What should the doctors do when they are working in an environment which is debilitating? Doctors, in my view, are very well paid. I try to encourage the younger generation of doctors not to complain about salaries, but everything else, because this may be ridiculous, because then you've got to factor in the value of the rand. But to imagine that in 1981, my first salary was 175 rand. And it was only after 9 months that it went to 350 rand. When I look at the salaries that the entry salary of doctors now, where it sits, I objectively think that doctors are reasonably paid, so they shouldn't be complaining about salaries. Now, that takes me to another point where I was saying an engagement is not being made. Doctors are vastly well paid, and nurses, I think justifiably so, as opposed to the rest of healthcare workers. This is already causing tension, because doctors then are the elite within the society of healthcare workers, and that is causing tension. So salaries are not the question. Another question. Remind me what that question was again. I just wanted to touch on that one to get to the.
Are there better ways to achieve change?
Better ways. Thank you.
Than strikes.
I was then saying I came to this platform with a request, hoping to hear from you guys. What should doctors do? And I'm now dispensing of the question of salaries. If they are working in environments with high expertise, high determination, very high moral values in terms of delivery through their profession, find themselves in situations where the environment is very disabling in the manners that I've mentioned to you. And most frustratingly, the leadership by the Department of Health, the administrative leadership by the Department of Health, most of the time is deplorable, and a lot of times it becomes a conduit for stealing from the resources of government. How should then doctors respond? How do I tell doctors who want to strike because they are speaking to dunderheads? How do I convince them that we can still engage people who have got no brains or have got reasons to be cerebrally paralyzed? How do I encourage the doctors to engage other than strikes? So I'm asking you now, as potential patients, as my community outside of the profession, help me. So Daleen, the question is back to you and the rest of everybody else. What are those?
Daleen, do you want to follow up on that quickly?
Please.
Yes, if I could. And thank you so much, Doctor, for quite an insightful discussion already. I think just from where I'm at, and also just from my own personal view, I had the opportunity of being part of a team looking at the workflows in a public hospital, and I was horrified at what we saw, and it really seemed to be a management issue, and I won't go into all the details, but I hear what you're saying, and my experience there too was that many of the doctors there were really going above and beyond. And it seemed to be in the lower echelons where it almost seemed to be a discontent that seemed to flow through in terms of the service delivery and the way that the work was being conducted, the items that were being ordered incorrectly and not sent back, and which means you couldn't order the correct items. And I don't know whether it's possible in terms of the hospital management of doctors. I'm sure you are already engaging with the office management, the hospital management on that level to try and address and get to in terms of the working. I'm not always about the salaries, but actually the environment and the feeling of morale in terms of the lower paid workers. I don't know whether that would be something that one could do, and I'm sure you have already done that though. So I'm not sure what the answer is. I've been scratching my head since going there and identifying the workflow issues. But it seems to be quite a conundrum.
Thank you very much. No, it's fine. You're helping me think, because I'd like to now echo what you're saying, but I enjoy it better coming from you. My answer is engagement. I mean, we are the medical profession. The reason we're able to help psychiatric patients, in spite of the fact that they haven't got the capacity to engage, is to find models of engagement with an insane person to the point that you are able to get that person to dance with you in terms of finding solutions. So therefore, if, as it is my opinion, there's insanity in administration and leadership by the Department of Health, we've got nothing else we can do better, that can achieve better than engaging them. So my answer is very simple. It's engagement. Even if we think the Department of Health is like a sanatorium, the only way we can win is by engaging them to the point where we win, as we do with psychiatric patients. I do not think that chaos is a cherishable alternative. Engagement, therefore, takes individuals who have a good sense of identity about who they are, who have an intrinsic authority, and I want to say divine authority, that is defiant of death, and who just want to be productive despite the environment that is disabling, who are able to make choices and judgment and discretion despite the debilitating environment, and then who are able to look after their fallibility and not making an excuse to then give in. So it's engagement. Going back to you, Nduluma, even in South Africa, it's engagement. Until there is sanity in the house, I don't see any alternative. And then I'll give you examples of two experiences which have got a stark difference in my own trajectory of working within the profession, just to illustrate the point of engagement. I worked in Gauteng, and in Gauteng, I was working at a hospital that should have been built for 370 million over a space of 3 years. It was built for 840 million over 10 years because there was corruption. When I walked into that hospital as a senior, reasonable professional, just going in to set up my department, I found so many faults in the construction of the hospital relevant to my service delivery with my department. The neonatal unit had temperature control, which was centralized with the rest of the hospital. So if the CEO wanted her office to be cold, the neonatal ward would be cold. If she wanted it to be warm, the neonatal ward would then suffer the heat that is beyond what is necessary. So what then happened, that gave me a cue that there could be a lot of other things that may have gone wrong. It would be a long story to tell here, but the construction of the hospital was deplorable. In fact, that hospital should have been shut down. In the first few months that it had opened, we were losing mothers and babies, mothers because of sepsis from the theater. I later discovered, after I got Zolile, who was then Department of Health Minister, to come and inspect the hospital, his team discovered that the smell, the odor, the bad odor that we were sensing in the passage next to the theater was actually a sign of sewage that was flowing under the floor of the theater, just close to the door of the theater. So the fumes of smell that were coming in there, of putrefaction, were carrying the bugs into theater. So the hospital was unbelievable. I mean, I still need to write a book about that hospital. Long story cut short, when you engage and you use decent methods to engage, you got to get ready for your neck to be on the block. After 4 years of engaging the Department of Health and ultimately the Premier Makura, I spoke to Makura myself personally because then at the end I was being persecuted because I was exposing rot, which in fact I thought had been covered up even by the Department of Health. And that is my persuasion even up to today. Then I was dismissed from the hospital. They had to find excuses to dismiss me. Contrast that now with coming to Eastern Cape, whatever bad image you have of the Eastern Cape or real image it has. I get into a hospital where the CEO of the hospital trusts me despite what she knows had happened in Gauteng. And in this hospital in Tata Regional, the CEO would not have meetings without my presence in her executive team, whether I was on those committees or not, because she saw that there was leadership that had authority, that had a secure sense of judgment and identity, and it was leadership which was prepared to put the neck on the block for the sake of sanity. So engagement, engagement, engagement. There are deeper layers to the story I'm giving you, but it's engagement, engagement, engagement. It always had risks. It always has no promise of immediate delivery, but it's engagement, engagement, engagement. Even at this hospital, initially, the unions in this hospital were petrified of the mention of my name, and they were rebellious to anything that had to do with me until during COVID, when certain meetings happened that nobody was having the strength to chair, I chaired those meetings. The unions came to me themselves and they said, we've never seen anybody chairing these meetings the way you do. But I decided to step down and step back so that it doesn't appear to be an ego drive. Please don't start me. I want thoughts from you guys.
Okay, so one thought, how about a public social media event by a large group of concerned doctors or other healthcare workers? I suppose as an alternative, if the direct engagement does not work, how about a public social media event to raise attention and awareness?
Thank you very much for that. Let me tell you, one of the reasons why we have this session today is exactly that. I do not think an idea, though, should start in social media. It should start with a few sound minds who share the same ideals. And this is what I'm building with a group of non-medical professionals whom I respect in the forum that we use for a lot of social intervention discussions. And I'm here, firstly, to hear your thoughts, and secondly, to garner your support so that when it goes social media viral, I know I've got a think tank that is looking in the same direction outside of the medical profession. Certainly that's the direction we should go, so that there could be a public voice that speaks into this space. I agree with you fully. You've taken a page out of my book, but it's a page that has got a few other pages before we get to.
Pepe says, very sad state of affairs, but not just healthcare, it's our country as a whole. We need biblical principles and Jesus to guide us and to pray.
I'm really looking for solid Christian thought outside of the medical profession to help me make my contribution within the profession on these serious issues. And I love the fact that you love this slide, Torsten.
Well, the big, I mean, to me, it's that becomes the slide of how do we move if we have degenerated into the right-hand side, how do we move back to the left? And specifically, how do we move back in an environment in which it's in the interests of some people to keep it on the right-hand side? So it's complex.
Torsten, if I may, I'd like to put the burden on the medical profession in this manner. The Bible says Jesus went out to teach, to preach, and to heal. If the medical profession is a profession of healers, they've got a responsibility to teach, and they've got a responsibility to preach. Now, the responsibility to teach is to help people understand knowledge that is on the table. The responsibility to preach is to expose people to knowledge that they did not have. In my view, the profession should be the healers of the nation beyond physical healing. I believe that the profession should provide vision to this country. It should provide social healing to this country. It should set the standard. The medical profession is an iconic profession, and it needs to be encouraged to not lose that identity, that social identity. And I feel that it would be encouraged, I'm persuaded, it's not a feeling, I'm persuaded that it would be encouraged to sustain its identity, its distinctive identity, not for its own ego, but for the benefit of society, by society itself. That's why I'm recruiting you guys to stand with me in invoking the profession to re-establish its identity in society in terms of respectable authority and also stewardship for the health of the nation.
So it just struck me as you were talking about the issues that it comes across as the main issue that doctors are wanting to change is their salaries. And if instead they seem to be really concerned about the work environment, about the fact that, you know, in the background you're not getting the right deliveries, so your patient care is affected. And that if the emphasis is on patient care, then I think doctors will get much more support from their patients and from other healthcare workers. Because if their emphasis is on that, then it looks like you can see that they care about their patients, and they care about the work environment. And if they really make that their emphasis, then the other healthcare workers, I think that the whole atmosphere at work already gets changed just by the fact that doctors are seen to emphasize not just their own, you know, environment that is beneficial, but everybody's work environment and the patient.
Vera, at the moment, having been the founder chairman of the association with everything that we achieved, which is slowly, or some of which is slowly getting corroded now by the social environment. After 19 years of staying away from leadership in the medical profession, I've sort of been sucked back by one of our guests, an old friend of mine, Dr. Mbambisa, who I invited intentionally. The new mood in which I'm bringing into the profession now is away from unionization and therefore the path to strikes, but to advocacy for the patient at the same time as we advocate for the doctor. So what you are saying is already in the pipeline, is already being, and I'm selling the idea of what I call shared stewardship. That means, therefore, instead of complaining to government, we challenge government to work with us for the benefit of the patient. So it changes the engagement with government away from selfish interests of the doctors, where selfish interests of the doctors are being raised. They are only in the context of improving patient care. So advocacy now, I've elevated the discussion on advocacy to not be advocacy about doctors, but to be advocacy about healthcare, in which doctors are agents and agencies to do so. When we founded the Medical Association, the slogan that says uniting doctors for the health of the nation, it was coined by me, especially that part that says for the health of the nation, because as foreseeing that we're going to become a selfish profession like all others who are inward looking. And so therefore, I'm now steering a maturation of what we meant when we said we're uniting ourselves for the health of the nation. So Vera, you're speaking to what we're already doing now, and it is necessary for us to hear this from ordinary community. Thank you for saying it.
I'm just tagging on to Vera's idea of patient care. And I just wanted to give an example. I think it was about 6 years ago, I ended up in ICU in a private hospital. And my biggest frustration during that whole time in ICU was the focus on diagnostics rather than just focusing on me as a person. And I ended up walking away from that experience with a serious anxiety and panic disorder, because the experience in ICU was the equivalent, I will use the word torture. I mean, I'm an international relations expert, and we look a lot at torture, and the definition matches what I experienced in that ICU. Constant light, constant noise, you literally, people were losing their minds around me and nobody seemed to care. It was the most horrific experience I've ever had, and that was a private hospital. So for me, the idea of focusing on the patient also emotionally, psychologically, that is being severely neglected in our hospitals. And in my case, no treatment helped except the moment I got out. The moment I was out of that environment, I started to recover. So I think that is just something I want to highlight.
May I speak to that a little bit? In my other life, I'm a minister of the gospel. I founded a church and ran it for 20 years. There's an extent to which in my ministry, especially at two levels. Firstly, engaging and ministering to people personally, but that's not where I'm at now. It's the point of preaching and teaching. Preaching and teaching can be very exciting if you are given the passion and the gift. And you may forget the audience and just get lost in the exercise of preaching and teaching, because it's very fascinating to hear from God and synthesize and interpret and help people understand and actually see them grasping it. But the exercise itself can be so exciting that you can get lost in it and forget the audience. Secondly, the saying that you enjoy the journey and not worry about the destination is deceptive in certain ways, because when you are treating patients, you have to think that you got to focus on the ultimate objective. Because if you don't, you can get lost in enjoying the journey, because it is academically, scientifically interesting, sometimes intense, and the intensity increases your element of interest to the point that you forget that the ultimate objective is to save the patient, and the patient not just physically, but also mentally and spiritually and psychologically, as you say. So I'm then saying the danger and the temptation of anything exciting is to forget its objective and just get lost in it. So I'm confessing our failure, and I'm just explaining it. It takes a person who is solid on identity, authority, stewardship, and judgment on all the aspects I mentioned to be able to rise above the excitement of the moment.
I think, and forgive me here, I'm probably going to be Captain Obvious, just echoing the obvious that's been stated already as for how we seem to have a problem beyond the profession of medicine and the medical, practice, just within our society, broader society of South Africa, which echoes some of the areas of concern that the medical profession is experiencing more particularly. And it just seems like we lack, I think the fulcrum is leadership, and just the fact that there's poor leadership all around. But we don't seem to be able to galvanize and organize our societies and set priorities in terms of the areas of priority for the country, for how we're going to move forward, etc. Because it's that guiding ideology or philosophy out of which departments need to work, out of which budgets need to be drawn, out of which professions need to be held responsible, and all those things you're talking about identity, productivity, etc., etc. All those things should be derived out of that clear understanding, but we just don't seem to. So I think in a way, sympathize with what's going on, but it's more a national issue, really. Where we're unable to just organize ourselves, and I think I certainly will think about this more. Doc, and try to see what I can contribute or write to you. But I just wanted to state that, yeah, it just feels like the problems you're having could be the same problems that are in the legal profession. I mean, well, contextually for them in that environment, and then everybody else. But overall, there's just a very distinct lack of leadership. So, yeah, I'm sorry for just taking up. I feel like my remarks are a bit redundant, but yeah.
May I stop you before they're not so far. Two things. One, I think, again, it's been mentioned here. Each of us have got individual agency. I believe God has positioned us to exercise where we are. I think this should hopefully encourage every one of us, and I saw somebody saying that, to actually do just that in our spaces, because there's not going to be organic change in the nation unless agents of change in their positions of endowment are able to do that. The second one is that I'm not saying this arrogantly. I really do believe that the medical profession is an iconic profession and it has to live up to that. If it fails to set that standard, I think the social unconscious is going to change. When doctors are seen to be as chaotic as everybody else, then some level of hope is going to be lost. Just as much as when the pulpit fails the nation, then a loss of hope, a lot of hope is lost.
Just want to read a message from Ntantla. Thank you, Doctor. May God give you strength and wisdom as you do your work and contribute to our country in the health space. I think he speaks on behalf of all of us. So on behalf of all of us, a huge thank you to you for this morning, and for also carving out the time in what I know is a busy schedule. Thank you for taking the time to engage us this morning. Really appreciate it.
Thanks to all of you for your hearts more than your ears.